Hello, it's Saturday, the 5th of November 2022. This magnificent display of 2 Laserdiscs and 4 VHS cassettes comprises 4 of the 5 movies that constitute the 20th Century Fox film franchise, The Fly. We have 1958's The Fly, 1959's Return of the Fly, the 1986 remake of The Fly, and the 1989 sequel to that movie, The Fly 2. So what I'm going to do today is examine these movies and in particular these releases in a little bit more detail. So this is an American Laserdisc and these are Australian VHS cassettes. They were released between 1988 and 1990, so more or less released in the wake of the 1980s Fly movies. So I imagine that there was renewed interest in the original films in this series, coming in the wake of the 1980s Fly movies. This is a double feature Laserdisc release of The Fly and Return of the Fly that was released by CBS Fox Video in 1989. I have talked about this release before, but I'm going to examine it in a little bit more detail this time. I bought this Laserdisc a couple of months ago, I think, from a place called Treasure Chest Salvage. It cost me the princely sum of $5 Australian, which that was a quite a bargain, I would say. This is a 2-disc release, so we have some of The Fly on side 1, the rest of The Fly plus some of Return of the Fly on side 2, and then we've got the rest of Return of the Fly on side 3. There's nothing on side 4. The Fly originated as a short story by the British-French writer George Langland, who actually led a pretty interesting life. Langland, he was a spy involved in special operations behind enemy lines in World War II. Anyway, after the war ended, Langland became a journalist and a writer, and he wrote a short story, The Fly, which is about a scientist, Andre Delombre, who is experimenting with matter transportation, breaking down and transporting and reforming objects and eventually live creatures between 2 devices. And then there's a mishap. When Delombre experiments on himself, a fly gets into one of the transmitter pods with him, and he ends up coming out the other side with a fly head and a fly arm, and then the fly ends up with his head and his arm, and the rest of the story is about Delombre trying to reverse the process, and he needs the help of his wife Helene to do that. The short story was first published in the June 1957 issue of Playboy magazine. 20th Century Fox quite rightly saw the commercial prospects of the story, and they acquired the rights to it. So the film was made and released in 1958. It was a really huge hit. It wasn't a particularly big budgeted film by 20th Century Fox's standards, but it was relatively had a relatively large budget compared to other monster movies of the time, and it was a really big hit. This is a 1989 VHS release of The Fly. It was released by CBS Fox Video. It's actually this was the copy that used to be in the Edith Cowan University. It was decommissioned. My dad worked as a librarian there, and he used to give me, some of the decommissioned stock from there. Anyway, so it actually, the blurb on the back manages to get the synopsis of the film quite massively wrong. I wonder if whoever wrote this blurb had actually seen the movie. But anyway, the person that wrote this says that Vincent Price stars as the scientist who ends up transformed into the fly, which isn't true. Vincent Price is a supporting actor in this. David Hedison, who was then going by the name Al Hedison, stars in this movie. He's probably best known for playing Felix Leiter in several of the James Bond movies. Patricia Owens plays the wife character Helene Delombre in this. Patricia Owens, she probably didn't have the career that she deserved. She is really, really good in this film, and her character, I mean, she's sort of required to do most of the heavy lifting narratively. Like, she carries the emotional arc of the movie, and she does a really good job. Vincent Price plays Delombre's brother Francois. He's good in this. I mean, I love Vincent Price. He's always good value. And Herbert Marshall plays a a police inspector. He's really good too. So it's a really good cast, a really good cast all around. I first saw this movie, The Fly. I believe it was sometime in the late 1990s. I saw it on cable TV. I'd already watched the David Cronenberg remake, the 1986 version of The Fly, many times. So I was quite curious to watch the original. And I have to say, it holds up really well. It's a really good example of superior 1950s Hollywood science fiction. It's sort of a blend of, well, I mean, it was scripted by James Clavell, who was British, and it was produced and directed by Kurt Newman, who was German. So the film actually has sort of a European, almost gothic melodrama sort of feel to it, as well as obviously being akin to a lot of the sort of 1950s movies that kind of lent into the whole, distrust of science. I mean, it's not really an atomic monster movie because it's not really to do with, radiation or anything, but it's a scientific experiment that goes wrong. So it's sort of akin to other movies of that ilk. I have read the original George Langland short story of The Fly, and the film is remarkably faithful to it. They didn't really change all that much in the translation to screen. It does change the setting of the story from France to Canada, and the character of Helene has a much more tragic fate in the original story than she does in the film. But apart from that, the film sticks pretty closely to the story. I think, I think they sort of realized, the filmmakers realized, they didn't really have to change all that much to render the story, effective on the big screen. I suppose there are some aspects of the film that you really have to suspend your disbelief for. I mean, I don't think it's ever really adequately explained why, when Delombre comes out with a fly head, why he still has his brain, and yet later on, the fly that has his head, his brain is in that version too. I don't really know, but I mean the quite rightly famous end sequence with the pitiful little fly with Delombre's head, getting devoured by a spider, and it's kind of like crying out, help me, help me. It's still a really good and very well executed scene. So it is essentially a tragic tale, but at the same time, the film does allow for some moments of some humor and of course the requisite shocks. I mean, the moment where Helene sees her husband with the fly head for the first time, and which is the first time the audience sees it, and she screams and reacts, and then we have the point of view of the fly seeing her screaming head, multiple times because of his multi-lensed eye. It's still a really good sequence, and I mean, I can imagine audiences in 1958 reacting with shock. I mean, it must have been one of those great shock reveals that happens throughout horror films in history. Obviously there are famous examples like the Lon Chaney in the 1925 Phantom of the Opera, when his deformed face is first revealed. So it's sort of following on in that great tradition. This is a 1990 VHS release of Return of the Fly that was released by CBS Fox Video. So as I mentioned before, The Fly was a really big hit in 1958. So 20th Century Fox, not surprisingly, was quite keen to get a sequel up and running. So it was done relatively quickly. The Fly was released in 1958. Return of the Fly was released in 1959. So the sequel picks up some years after the original, and the son of the deceased Delombre from the first film, Philippe Delombre, he's a scientist as well, and he wants to recreate his father's experiments. And you can sort of guess what happens. Return of the Fly was made during that era when film sequels weren't especially common, and the ones that were made, the film studios tended to not really spend very much money on them. So with The Fly was filmed in color in CinemaScope. Return of the Fly was filmed in CinemaScope as well, but it was filmed in black and white. So right off the bat, you can sort of see that they were spending less money on it. The original movie, The Fly, it had a budget of $500,000, I believe, and Return of the Fly had a budget of $225,000. So they were literally spending half the amount of money on the sequel as they did on the original. Kurt Newman didn't have anything to do with Return of the Fly. Unfortunately, he died only a month after the first movie was released. So Return of the Fly, it was scripted and directed by Edward Burns, who he was involved with the Three Stooges prior to this. So Return of the Fly, it's not a great movie. It's okay for what it is. It's kind of enjoyable. I do like that front cover of of the Fly, sort of greeting Vincent Price like an overenthusiastic dog. Yeah. So it's okay. It's very it has much more of a sort of a schlocky, sort of typical 50s monster movie feel to it. Brett Halsey plays Philippe Delambre in human form when he transforms into the Fly later on. It's not Brett Halsey that plays the creature. It's they got some I think he was a German circus like giant strongman guy, so the character becomes a lot taller, and he's sort of fixed with a fly head that's nowhere near as good as the fly head from the original movie. It's sort of oversized, so you've got this kind of sort of ridiculous looking creature sort of stomping around and killing people. Yeah, but Vincent Price is back in this, of course. He's as Francois Delambre. I think he's the only cast member from the first movie that came back in the sequel. Obviously, there is absolutely nothing wrong with a movie being in black and white, but you can tell just in this case, it's immediately a sign of the diminished production values between the first movie and the second one. You can just tell that they're spending a lot less money and a lot less time. They were just churning this one out, rather quickly as an exploitation piece. So The Fly is 94 minutes, I believe, and Return of the Fly is 78 minutes. So Return of the Fly is, less than 80 minutes. One thing that I think is really interesting is that you can tell precisely what the differences are between the two movies, the approaches for both movies, just by looking at the original trailers for both films. If you look at the trailer for The Fly, I mean, yes, the trailer is hosted by Vincent Price, but it's very ominous and very enigmatic. It really doesn't show anything much at all from the film itself. It relies a lot on like disconnected sound bites from the movie and some abstract imagery. It's very effective. It's a really good trailer, and I can just imagine audiences at the time, wondering, what is this movie about? Because it really does lean heavily on the mystery, the mysterious aspect of the story. Whereas Return of the Fly, you watch the trailer for that, and it's really, it's immediately apparent that it's a very different kind of movie. The trailer, it pretty much shows everything that happens in the movie in it. It has a very overbearing voiceover. Very melodramatic, very corny, very campy, and it goes something like, "This is the son of the original Fly, daring to explore the forbidden science of transmigration that brought horrible death to his father." And then it goes on, like, referring to some of the other creatures that end up getting created in the course of the movie. The voiceover man refers to the twisted monstrosities of a living hell. And it just goes on like that. It's very sensationalistic. It's very schlocky. The trailer actually ends with a tagline emblazoned across the screen that describes the film as the thriller chiller that will really bug you. I'm not going to argue that the first movie is, high art or anything, but it was sort of, it was punching above its genre. It was trying to be, maybe a little bit more intelligent than, superficially what it seemed. Whereas Return of the Fly, it's more zany. It's more of a, it's much more of a 50s style, monster movie, more of a B movie. So yeah, you just watching the two trailers, and precisely what you're getting with each one. There was a third installment in the original series. It was A Curse of the Fly. It was released in 1965, so 6 years after Return of the Fly. It was a British film. It was directed by an Australian filmmaker, Don Sharp, who made some Hammer horror films, and it stars George Baker as Martin Delambre, the grandson of Andre Delambre from the original film. Curse of the Fly, it sort of languished in relative obscurity for quite a few decades. I'm sure it screened on television after its original theatrical release, but it was never released on VHS. It was never released on Laserdisc. I don't believe it was officially released on any home video format until the DVD release in 2007. I have seen it. It's not a very good movie at all, to be perfectly honest. But anyway, so we had The Fly in 1958, Return of the Fly in 1959, and Curse of the Fly in 1965. That was the extent of the original series, but as subsequent events would demonstrate, it was not the end of the Fly movies. So after that, we're going to head into the 1980s. The remake of The Fly was released in 1986, and its sequel, The Fly 2, followed in 1989. This is a Laserdisc double film set of The Fly and The Fly 2. It was released in 1996 by 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment. I bought this as an import. It's actually a British edition. It's a UK edition. It's a 2-disc set, so 2 double-sided discs. We'll take a look inside. So we can see it's a gatefold with some extensive liner notes there. Both discs, they actually have extra features. The Fly has the film's trailer, and The Fly 2 has that film's trailer as well as a behind-the-scenes featurette. So this was kind of during a period when extra features were largely the domain of Laserdiscs, like VHS releases generally didn't have them. But have a look at the discs. So here is The Fly, side 1, side 2. And here is The Fly 2, side 1 and side 2. This is an original Australian VHS rental edition of The Fly. It was released by CBS Fox Video in 1987. The very first time I saw The Fly was on video, so it would have been via a copy that would have been identical to this. It's an R-rated movie, restricted to 18 years and older. I wasn't 18. I think I must have been 14 or 15 when I saw the film, but I guess the person in the video shop, either I looked older than I was, or maybe they just didn't care and didn't enforce the R-rated policy. But anyway, so yeah, this is a really good release. It's have a closer look inside. Yeah, back in the day, CBS Fox Video had a couple of tricks to try and deter video pirates, to sort of make it obvious that these were genuine editions. As you can see, there's a CBS Fox watermark on the window there, and also they had the distinctive coloured spine. So, yeah. So there was a trend in the 1980s for older films getting remade in a more expertly violent fashion. We had, of course, John Carpenter's The Thing, Brian De Palma's Scarface, Paul Schrader's Cat People. Later on, we had Chuck Russell's The Blob. And so, yeah, there was David Cronenberg's The Fly. I mean, it does what I think a good remake should do, which is it takes the core elements of a classic movie. It doesn't discard what was interesting about the original premise, but it takes that premise and sort of does its own thing. And so the 1986 version of The Fly is a radical reinvention of the original, unlike the 1958 version where Al Hedison played a scientist who was largely mute for the better part of the picture, hidden under a hood, and then he's got a fly head. He's, basically an instant monster. He's instantly transformed. In the Cronenberg version, we have Jeff Goldblum playing a scientist who gradually metamorphosizes into a creature. So he's articulate, he's aware of what's happening to him, he comments on it, and we have obviously state-of-the-art special effects, makeup effects, a great deal more sexuality, more existentialism. It lends itself to more metaphorical readings. It's got Cronenberg's philosophy regarding the flesh, and so forth. The impetus to remake The Fly in the 1980s came from producers Stuart Cornfeld and Mel Brooks. Yes, that Mel Brooks. And they hired a screenwriter called Charles Edward Pogue to write the script. So Pogue's original screenplay, I have read it. It is included as a extra feature, a viewable feature on the DVD release of The Fly. It's quite interesting. It's sort of a halfway point between the 1958 movie and the 1986 movie. I mean, there's a lot in it that are recognizable parts of the finished film, but in some respects it cleaves closer to the original movie. Like, for instance, the main characters in the Pogue screenplay are a married couple. I think they were called Jeff and Barbara, if memory serves. So that's obviously quite different to what happened after David Cronenberg got involved. I think there's also a subplot in the Pogue screenplay to do with the scientific corporation wanting to exploit the transmitter pods, which is a plot point that would be expanded upon a great deal in The Fly 2, not in The Fly. Brooks and Kornfeld's first choice of director was David Cronenberg, who'd made quite a name for himself, mostly in the field of body horror with films like Shivers, Rabid, The Brood, Scanners, Videodrome, and then he'd had a relatively mainstream hit with filming Stephen King's The Dead Zone for Dino De Laurentiis. Cronenberg, unfortunately, wasn't available at that time to direct The Fly because he was working for De Laurentiis, making Total Recall. So Brooks and Kornfeld went to a English filmmaker, Robert Bierman, who had directed some commercials and short films. Bierman was actually hired to direct The Fly. He agreed to make it, and then something really bad happened. Bierman's daughter was tragically killed. Bierman had to pull out of the project, and Brooks and Kornfeld actually suspended production to give Bierman time to reconsider. They understood why he said he couldn't do it, but they had the project waiting for him if he decided, it was there waiting for him if he changed his mind. Bierman ultimately decided he couldn't make the movie, and by happenstance, by the time all this had happened, Cronenberg had actually been fired from Total Recall, so he was able to take over The Fly. Bierman, incidentally, went on to direct the Nicolas Cage vampire movie, Vampire's Kiss, which is a really good movie. Cronenberg extensively rewrote the Charles Edward Pogue screenplay. So Jeff Goldblum was cast as the scientist, Seth Brundle. Gina Davis was cast as Veronica Quaife, the investigative journalist that falls in love with Brundle, and John Getz plays Stathis Borans, the Veronica's ex-boyfriend, who kind of completes the sort of I guess it's kind of a love triangle of sorts, but so it's much more of a character-driven piece than the original film, which I think was more situation-based. Released as it was in 1986, a lot of critics and commentators thought that The Fly was an AIDS metaphor, but Cronenberg has disavowed that notion. I mean, I think he used the condition of Seth Brundle as a metaphor for disease in general, or really just I think he's even said aging. So The Fly was a really big hit. It was kind of a career-making turn for both Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis. I mean, they'd both been in movies before this, mostly supporting roles, but this kind of was the most high-profile thing that both of them had done at this point. And with Cronenberg, it was really important for him. I mean, it was a perfect example of a filmmaker scoring a big commercial success, but at the same time without compromising the filmmaking principles. And actually, if anything, with Cronenberg leaning even more heavily into the ideas and philosophies that characterized his earlier films. I have seen The Fly many, many times over the years. It's a film that's very near and dear to me. I'm not really, I mean, to me, I consider The Fly a perfect movie. I mean, I'm not content to just regard it as one of the greatest horror movies of all time. I regard it as one of the greatest films of all time. It's my favorite David Cronenberg film. I think it's the best movie of 1986, and I don't use those words lightly, because 1986 was a pretty great year for movies. I mean, it was also the year of Aliens, Blue Velvet, Platoon, Salvador, Manhunter, Stand By Me, Transformers the movie. So yeah, we're talking creme de la creme. An assortment of things I love about The Fly: the writing, the direction, the acting, the dialogue, the makeup and practical effects. I love the fact that Stathis Borans, the guy who, in any other film he would have been played by William Atherton and would have been like an irredeemable jerk. But, in The Fly, he kind of steps up to the plate and, becomes, if not a hero, then at least, an ally. That's really good. One of my all-time favorite film-going experiences was in 2012 when I attended a double screening of Alien and The Fly. I mean, I'd seen The Fly many times by this point, but only on VHS and DVD. I'd never seen it on the big screen before. I was a little curious to see how it would play with the audience because I noticed that a lot of the people coming to see the film were quite young, and I thought that maybe a lot of them hadn't seen the movie before. So it was kind of I was curious to see if I was watching it with a first time audience. But anyway, it was really interesting. I did overhear some young women giggling about the film, and one of them said that they'd come to see the movie because Jeff Goldblum was in it, and they thought Jeff Goldblum was really cute. But anyway, so the movie played. I think it was second on the bill. It came after Alien, and yeah, it was interesting. I mean, for about the first half of the film, the audience, I mean, there was a lot of laughing, but I mean, they were laughing in all the right places because The Fly is quite, for the first half, maybe the first third, the film is actually quite, it's deliberately funny in places. It's very quirky. It's almost like an off-kilter romantic comedy. Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis, they both have fantastic chemistry. I don't believe they were married in real life at the time, but they were certainly a couple. And yeah, so there was just a lot of just a lot of parts of the movies that were hitting the audience in the right way. I mean, Stathis Borans, played by John Getz. I mean, the audience loved him. Like almost all of his snarky rejoinders and cynical one-liners. Like the audience just loved him. And then the mood started to change when Seth Brundle's transformation starts to become, more grotesque. And there's just all those sequences, like the arm wrestling scene where Brundle snaps a guy's forearm. There's the dream sequence with the maggot baby, and just once bits of Brundle were like falling off, like his with all the goo and the his fingernails coming off and bits of his body coming off. Like the audience were like they were really reacting quite, they were sort of revulsed by it, as and the bit where Brundle vomits on his donuts, and when his ear drops off, and then Gina Davis like hugs him even after his ear's just fallen off, and the audience was screeching and everything, and it was just really good. Like they were responding to the film in just the right way, and it just builds up to such a great climax. At the end when Brundle transforms into a grotesque bug monster, and then he gets his head blown off. Spoiler alert for a movie that's over 35 years old. Yeah, and then the audience at the end just clapped and applauded when it had finished. It was really good. It was actually one of the best times I've ever had at a cinema screening. I did see the Fly again on the big screen last year, and it went down almost as well that time too. It still holds up really, really well. It's such a great audience reactive kind of movie. And so if you get the chance to see the Fly on the big screen with an audience, I would say take it. This is an Australian ex-rental VHS release of The Fly 2. This was released by CBS Fox Video in 1990. I liberated this from a video store at some point, legally, I assure you. So once again, we can see that this has got the telltale marks of authenticity, the CBS Fox watermark on the window there, and this one's got a yellow spine. So yeah, CBS Fox doing its bit to deter all those people out there that might have been trying to flood the market with bootleg copies of The Fly 2. So history repeats. The original Fly was a big hit in 1958, and 20th Century Fox rushed a sequel in 1959. The remake of The Fly was a big hit in 1986, and then Fox was pretty keen to get a sequel up and running, and The Fly 2 followed in 1989. So the film was, I don't know if it was ever offered to David Cronenberg, if there was ever any chance of Cronenberg directing the sequel. I don't think he would have wanted to do that. Cronenberg, he wasn't the kind of guy to, sort of redo what he'd already done. And I think at that point he was probably working on Dead Ringers. So anyway, the project was offered to Chris Walas, who had done the special effects, the makeup effects for the Fly, and had actually won an Academy Award for it. So he directed it. It was his first film as director. The screenplay was written by Mick Garris, Jim and Ken Wheat, and Frank Darabont. Mick Garris had done he's done a lot of Stephen King adaptations. Jim and Ken Wheat, they were the the screenwriters of A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, and Frank Darabont. At that time, Frank Darabont was working on a lot of horror film writing. He co-wrote A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 in 1987. He co-wrote The Blob in 1988, and then he did The Fly 2 in 1989. Darabont, of course, went on to script and direct The Shawshank Redemption. I like The Fly 2. It's not as good as The Fly. It's nowhere near as good as The Fly, but I still think it deserved better than it got. And I think it's an interesting sequel. I mean, to its credit, it doesn't slavishly imitate the first movie. It sort of does its own thing. It kind of takes it expands upon what was established in the first film. I don't think it really does right by the Veronica Quaife character, to be perfectly honest. But if you put that aside, I think the film, it sort of stakes out its own territory, and it tells, I think, a fairly engaging story on its own. If you sort of accept the movie on its own terms and accept it as more of a monster movie than the original one, it sort of lacks the heart of the original. But I still think it's an entertaining movie, and I think it's got some really good gross out special effects. So in The Fly 2, Eric Stoltz plays Martin Brundle, who's the offspring of the main characters from the first movie. Because of his accelerated genes, he's only 5 years old, but he's got the body of a 25-year-old, and he's got he's quite advanced intellectually as well. So he's raised by the Bartok Corporation, which possesses the telepods from the first movie, and then he's put to work trying to repair the pods and get Seth Brundle's matter transportation process to work, and at the same time he hits a point where he actually starts to mutate because his fly genes, which had been dormant, start to take effect, and then it's all about him discovering that the Bartok Corporation has actually been anticipating his transformation and waiting for it to happen, and because it wants to exploit him. And then it just Martin turns into a disgusting beast and starts rampaging through the Bartok complex, killing people. So there are some pretty good bits in this movie. I'm quite partial to the fly creature spraying vomit on a guy's face, and he sort of claws his own face off, leaving a skull. You can sort of see it there. There's a bit where a guy gets his head flattened by an elevator. And I really like Eric Stoltz is pretty good in this. Daphne Zuniga's sort of she does the best she can with the love interest role. But I really like Lee Richards as Bartok, the villain. He's kind of it's a really good performance. He has this veneer of paternalism that sort of masks he's just like this venal, amoral capitalist arsehole that's sort of gleefully waiting for a child that he's kind of raised almost like a son, but he's waiting for him to transform. It's a really good performance. So The Fly 2 actually in some respects, it's a loose remake of Return of the Fly from 1959 because, like that movie, it's a sequel to a movie where the son of the main character from the first film becomes the main character in the second, and the son is trying to recreate his deceased father's experiments, and then he ends up getting transformed into a fly as well.
I first became familiar with The Fly 2 before I really knew much of anything about The Fly 1 in Easter of 1989. So this would have been April 1989. I was 6 years old. I taped the biblical movie The Greatest Story Ever Told off television, and all the commercial breaks were retained. And The Fly 2 was having its theatrical run in Australia at the time, and there were a couple of TV spots for The Fly 2 that I had inadvertently recorded. And I used to sort of watch those TV spots over and over again and willfully traumatize myself by them as a kid because they were, I thought they were really scary. The first TV spot was a truncated version of the film's trailer. The second one was a unique TV spot that, funnily enough, has never been included as an extra feature on any of the DVDs or Blu-rays of The Fly 2. But fortunately, I did preserve the very same copy that I taped in 1989, and it goes kind of something exactly like this.
Hush, little baby, don't be sad. You'll grow up to be like Dad. Hush, little baby, don't you cry. Just be 'cause your dad was the fly.
The fly, too, like father, like son.
Terrifying. There is some unused footage of Jeff Goldblum from the first movie that is repurposed in the sequel, but John Getz as Stathis Borans, he's the only cast member from the first movie that elected to appear in the sequel. He's pretty good. Yeah, so The Fly 2, it didn't really do too well, unfortunately, and it got kind of ripped apart by the critics. I mean, yeah, it doesn't have the intellectual resonance of Cronenberg's film. I mean, once you accept that Chris Walas is more of a craftsman, than than I guess a philosophical, creative storyteller, then it sort of kind of leans towards why the film just doesn't have the gravitas of Cronenberg's film. But like I said before, it's still pretty good. I'll still go to bat for The Fly too. Yeah, I mean, it does have its fans. They've sort of come out of the woodwork over the years. I mean, the Cronenberg film has grown, just keeps growing in stature, I feel. And The Fly 2, it's not to the same extent, but there are people that like it, and God bless them.
I don't know what lies in the future for the Fly franchise. There was talk in 2007, I believe, of another remake of the original, but from what I read, it sounded pretty terrible. It was going to be directed by some music video director, and he was bragging about how in this version the Fly will actually fly. And yeah, it just, fortunately, that didn't happen. I suppose ever since Disney acquired 20th Century Fox, I guess they own the rights to the Fly franchise. Whether they do anything with it, who knows? I do know that some years later, David Cronenberg actually had he wrote a script for a sequel of some sort to the Fly, his version, but the studio wasn't biting, which, to be honest, is really annoying, because I feel that if David Cronenberg writes a script for a sequel to The Fly and you're the studio, you let David Cronenberg make a sequel to The Fly. But yeah, who knows?
So that is it. And now, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to buzz off.